My name is Latislaw. I'm an Android GDE, and I've been playing around with a lot of different technologies over the years. I was even an iOS developer for a bit. But I found that I really enjoyed Android development, and part of that was it was just so accessible to all of the world, basically. So keynote I have been giving is Android is the World Phone for the last year, and that's focusing on emerging markets. This is kind of the abstraction of that, of all the things I was talking about are important to everyone. So I'm going to talk about it more as just how everyone can access that throughout the world, wherever you are. Cool. Oh, and I like to sketchnote a lot. I don't know if you've seen them or not, but if you've ever tried sketchnoting, please do one here. And if you haven't, I would encourage you to start, and then I will retweet you if I see one in my feed. And there's my Twitter handle. It's just my name. Cool. So my day job has now become my passion. I've always really cared about bridging the digital divide, and now I get paid to go to Tanzania and help install solar in people's homes. So these are some of our customers, but basically we go to small huts and we install solar, and it allows kids to be able to read at night and study. It allows people to create barbershops, things like that. So it's really interesting from that perspective, from the humanitarian sort of perspective. But from the technical side, we also have to manage battery power. Network is pretty much non-existent most of the time. And then also it's really bright sunshine, so that you want to turn up the brightness really high. So then you have to think about that even with the battery and stuff. So it's really interesting work from those different perspectives. So why do you care? Well, in the last decade, and not even a decade, basically phones have become completely indispensable to our modern lives. And there's an app for everything. If you leave your phone at home for the day, you feel like something is absolutely missing. It's really kind of it's a feeling I'm not quite used to, because in the past it was like if I left my pager, it wasn't that big a deal. But if you leave your phone, it's just like, oh my gosh, I have no contact with the outside world. I might get killed or lost. What's going to happen? Don't even know anymore. But Android is available in 190 countries throughout the world. There's 1 million new Android devices activated daily. And 85% of the global market is Android phones. 85%. Like, that's an overwhelming majority. And that's only 2 billion Android users right now. And there's 7 billion people in the world. So there's a lot of room for growth there. And we're just starting to get to that point where we're going to reach most of the world, probably with only Android devices. Welcome. And like I said, I've been talking about emerging markets for a while, and we're not going to cover them in depth here. But basically, in the next decade, the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, are going to be where most of that growth is going to happen. And major drivers here are the prices of the phones, and then also access to data is rapidly expanding there. So if we're talking about the applications, 65 billion were downloaded last year alone. And then there's another 1.5 billion every month. That includes both free and paid, but that's a lot of apps. And then basically, if you think about it, markets have only been around since 2008 for Google Play. I think it was 2007 for Apple. And that was not a thing that was possible before. Basically, you'd have to create an application specifically for an OEM. It wasn't portable. They all had their own rules. Now we have a system where everybody in the world can get the same applications through these markets, which is pretty amazing. And if you talk about how much money can be made there, this is the estimate for how much it's going to be worth by 2020, $102 billion. That's up from 2012, which was $53 billion. So it's doubling in less than 8 years. That's a huge possibility for you to get in on if you're not already there. And this simply wasn't possible before those platforms were created. So that's all the statistics I'm going to throw at you. But basically, it's important and you should care. It's really big and probably bigger than you imagined. And just keep that in mind. Like, Android is a really great place to be as far as career choices go. But one of the major challenges is if your app doesn't work that well in a developed market, it's just kind of annoying. It crashes. Maybe your battery dies early and you bring your little booster pack. But in emerging markets, you might have to walk to charge your phone. You might have to pay a bunch of money. You have to pay for data by the bit. So like all of this really adds up to huge issues for them, annoyances for us. So the more that you think about it, the more you can make your application better throughout the world. So basically today I'm going to talk about the design challenges you should be thinking about, technical challenges that you should think about, also testing, and then finally a framework for thinking about how to be globally inclusive with your applications. And what's really kind of interesting from all the numbers I threw at you is basically more people have more access to your apps than ever before. And you have an opportunity to build deep connections with billions of people, and that's just going to continue to grow in the next few years. And Android is accessible to the world over. It truly is the world's phone. But yeah, so let's talk a little bit about design. As you know, design plays an integral role in any application. And some of the applications, if you're globally targeting, then you've got diverse challenges, such as social norms, infrastructure, with like electricity and access to that. Even education and cultural differences are really important to think about as well. We'll touch on a little bit of those throughout here. But despite our differences and the differences throughout the world, a well-designed app should bring us together instead of separating us. So one of the things you need to develop, if you don't already have it, is empathy for people in the rest of the world. And it's really hard to get that understanding if you haven't gone through the same sorts of experiences that other people have gone through. Global experience doesn't really mirror our own. Android developers paid pretty well, great, strong network. That's not the same for the rest of the world. On average, you have a global person with a grade school education and limited access to technology and infrastructure. So it's a very different view on the type of people that you're going to be targeting. And not everyone throughout the world has the same tech background. So I don't know about you, but I grew up and I had the like dial-up, and then I had a pager, and then I had a PDA, and then I had an MP3 player. Well, before that, a cassette, Walkman. So I've had all these different devices throughout the years that slowly built on each other. Sometimes we're getting combined, and then I get to throw away 5 devices for this brand new device. This is not something that most of the world has seen. So that really speeds the adoption when you've gone through the evolution with all those different devices. And really, we tend to take for granted things like double-clicking. Like, we've been doing it for 30 years, but I tried to teach a child in Mexico how to double-click, and it was just not really an intuitive motion. I had to keep showing them how to quickly type twice. But if you think about it, billions of people, their first access to the internet is going to be through cellular networks, and their first computer is going to be a smartphone. So I got a real computer, and they probably won't see those until maybe later in college or whatever, but a lot of people are getting phones in their homes because they're very cheap. I didn't talk about the prices, but they're trending down to like $30, which makes it really accessible to just about everyone. So with design, you really want to make sure that you're working in network-constrained environments, which isn't just in developing markets. It's still annoying here, too. I get loss of coverage all the time or rate limited. Right now, I'm rate limited, so all my apps are slow and I can't fetch anything. So, I mean, this is something that it helps me now, even living in Philadelphia nearby here. I have usually pretty good access. But part of that whole offline thing is you want to think through the flows. So designers typically don't think about, oh, well, this is going to require me talking to the server. But that's our job as developers to say, hey, so this flow you have here means I need 5 round trips to the server before I can complete, and that means that I can't do this offline. So anything that you can figure out how to break and basically break that dependence on the server and figure out how to do that flow either by local algorithms or something so that you don't have to say, hey, server, is this a thing I can do? Really helps you to be able to work better offline. You also want to do things like cache so that it makes sense whenever you're offline, things like that. Yeah, so what I'm doing at Off Grid Electric, this is basically the major focus of what I'm working on. We write an application that helps people sell and maintain the solar systems, essentially. It's basically an internal business app, but it needs to work well offline. So historically, we go and fetch the whole, we say, hey, does this customer exist? Well, we've come up with different ways to do that instead of asking the server for that. And we've tried to break about 4 or 5 different flows that used to go to the round trip server, and now you can do it all offline, and we tell the user that it isn't quite synced yet, and at some point they know when they do see the sync button that it's actually gone through. So you're probably familiar with human-centered design. That's the concept of doing things like prototyping and iterating to make sure that you get to an end goal that your users can identify with. So you do this by, for example, you use prototyping. So this is something that's kind of difficult for us because I work in Philadelphia, but my people are in Tanzania. So how do I get a prototype in their hands and get feedback on that? It's pretty hard to see where they struggle if you can't watch them immediately and see what's happening. And also, if you think about prototypes, if you do it in software, that's the slowest path to getting feedback. You can do paper prototypes and a bunch of other different things. Like, I don't know if you saw anything about Google Glass, but their first thing was a huge fake thing that they kind of put against themselves to see what it would kind of be like to see a glass out there. It was totally paper and wire, and it wasn't software or hardware. And then eventually it became a product that went nowhere. But, that's how they started out, figuring out how they might want to go with this particular device. And if you're the kind of person who thinks, oh, that person's an idiot, why did QA find that? That's stupid, the designers are wrong, you're going to have a really hard time having empathy for the rest of the people in the world, and you really need to break that. I mean, if something wasn't intuitive, that's really a failure on your part, not theirs. Basically, what you want to do is create a universally acceptable design, and you have a bunch of different people that you're serving with those designs as well. So trying to find some sort of common ground, or making very specific apps if you need to tailor to certain segments. Cool, so now we have an open mind, time to get some feedback. Like I already said, it's a little bit difficult because of geography, but that's not the only problem with feedback. Sometimes people give you, direct answers, but if you just implemented that wouldn't be the thing your users needed most. Or sometimes just watching people changes the results of your experiment. So, for example, at Off Grid, we have a paper slideshow essentially that they're showing people, and people were following them around, figure out what they're doing in their sales process. So the decision was, well, let's make that into a presentation app. So then we start making the presentation app, and we're observing. Turns out, when people are there, they use it all the time. But when nobody is there, they don't use it at all. So basically, we decided we needed to make the software that took like 6 months, 3 months, and it just wasn't as effective as it could have been because they were being watched. So they did the right things while they were being watched. So you have to be very careful of that sort of thing. So if we want to see people struggle in person, the best way to do that really is to travel. Not everybody can do that, but there is no substitute for direct experience, basically. It really helps open your eyes to daily frustrations in different conditions. So for example, like I mentioned that I went to Mexico, that was in 2014. I bought a tiny little smartphone with a local data plan, opened up Instagram, all my data was gone. Completely gone. So I had to go buy more data. This isn't something that you would normally experience here, so you wouldn't think, oh, well, I need to reduce X, Y, and Z to make this better. But that was one thing that I went just from a visitor's perspective. But if that's your day-to-day, that really kind of sucks. And I don't know if you saw the talk from Facebook and Instagram. They gave one here at Droidcon New York in 2014, where they sent a bunch of people in the field, basically to do that by local phones and data plans and figure out what was working, and most of it wasn't. So they started rewriting the application from scratch, and they've even created Facebook Lite, for example, which is like I think it's 1 megabyte, works on 2G, and it uses far less data than the regular Facebook. So if they hadn't have traveled, they wouldn't have done that. But if you can't travel, other things you could do is try and find local contractors that you could contract with, or maybe talk to user groups like GDGs or something like that. So like I mentioned, I work for a company that installs in Tanzania. So last November, I spent the whole month there learning from my coworkers and what does and doesn't work for them, looking at the app in its native habitat. So one of the days I went out and did service calls to go check on people's solar systems. So we go out and it's like an hour drive to the base of the mountain, and then we're going on these back roads. We get to the first house, pretty easy to find, except GPS doesn't really tell us where we are, and the GPS for the customer's off too, but we're just asking people that we run into on the farms and stuff, and they kind of point us in the right way. So we get there, we finish the task, great. Now we go to the second one, and this one is another, I think it was probably 2 hours or something on these back roads in the middle of nowhere. And this was also the rainy season, so all the roads were washing out. We were taking really long ways around. It was really muddy, getting lost. Same sort of thing, you have to keep asking people. Eventually we get there. We're in a van, by the way, not a 4-wheel drive vehicle at all. And then we do the task. They need a brand new system, so we install it, and then they're in the app. They're supposed to click, okay, well, they got blah, 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 and save. The save didn't work at all. There's no data out there, and there's no way to cache those responses in the legacy app. So what had to happen is they had phones, so they called the call center, like, hey, so I'm at this person's house, please finish this task up. But that's what's happening a lot. So we have an app that's supposed to help people, but doesn't do anything in the field for a lot of the people that they go to visit. So that was frustrating. But then when we came home, it started raining. Well, actually, so you see this huge cloud off in the distance. It's like red underneath it because it's been picking up all this dust, and it was very, very scary. And then it's just completely washing out all the roads. We couldn't go back the same way we came. We're in this van that isn't four-wheel drive, and then it starts slipping in the mud. And I thought the guy was just kind of playing around because he was just doing this over and over again. But it turns out, it was just that slippery because when I got out, I actually fell. That was fun. But yeah, so we would get out, we'd push the van, get stuck again. Get out, push the van, get stuck again. And then we finally came across Maasai. They're the farmers and the warrior tribe in the area of Arusha. And they had a tractor. So they actually pulled us out to the gravel road over some trees, small trees, but still trees. It was an intense thing. And we left at like 8 a.m. We got home at 9 p.m. So that was 2 tasks throughout an entire day, which for me is a crazy story, but for them that's probably a day-to-day or at least a monthly occurrence. This is something that the people I'm serving need to do all the time. And you really wouldn't get that if you didn't go travel and figure out what your users are doing. TLDR. Cool. So that's kind of the design talk. And we're going to talk a little bit about development now. Part of the Well, I don't think it's not a problem, but what we do as developers, we have probably the smartest, latest smartphone. We have really good data plans. We have Wi-Fi to offset data usage. Basically, we have the best experience possible, and that doesn't really track with what our users are experiencing. It's very far off from the majority of people in the world when they have smaller, less powerful phones. So you need to step back and have a little bit of empathy for what they might be doing. Let's talk about what some of the things they might be encountering. First, they have these legacy devices, or, well, they might be new, but they're still small. They don't have a lot of memory. They're pretty cheap, small screens. Ideally, Android One would help here. We'll see. I don't know. It's still kind of jury's out on that. But the idea there is that it's decent specs, and it'll have like an all-day battery and fast processor and kind of keep lockstep with the newest Android OS releases. It's still out there. It's not dead yet. We'll see if it continues to grow. But it'd be nice if we could just assume everybody has latest and greatest specs, but we can't. So keep towards the lower end of the spectrum for now. And to make sure that you're serving people with these types of devices, you want to make sure that you're profiling your memory usage and finding anything that's wasting cycles, basically, any performance improvements that you can find. And then also if you do things like image processing, that takes up a lot of power. Calling the network takes up a lot of power. So anywhere that you can cut any of those things is definitely useful. And they don't have a lot of storage space on their device. I had, not even like 4 years ago, like I had like a smaller HTC something or other that I can't remember. Oh, incredible. I had to delete apps all the time. This, I assume, is going to be a fairly regular occurrence for people in developing nations, for example. But Google recommends you keep it about 10 megabytes from their Building for Billions talk. And if you haven't seen that, I highly suggest watching it. They have a YouTube video and a whole documentation set that goes along with it for more details on the types of things you can do to make your app better. Because this is kind of a high level. These are the things you should think about. That actually tells you some of the things you can do. But yeah, basically, if it's much bigger than 10 megabytes, it's unlikely they'll install your app because they have to pay for it, and it takes up a lot of space. At OGE, or Off-Grid Electric, excuse me, we're about 2 megabytes right now, and we're trying to keep it that low, but it's kind of hard when you do a multimedia app, the slideshow thing I mentioned. Another thing you can do is doing multiple APKs, or creating a light version like Facebook did. So they have a 1 megabyte version and then the normal version. But basically, at its core, you want to make sure that your app is only as big as it needs to be, and you want to look at the dependencies that you're pulling in, because a lot of time that adds to the APK bloat. So you can do things like looking at different libraries and figuring out which ones are big, and what do they really buy you? That was the big question you want to know. It's like, is this huge library actually giving me a benefit that I can use? Look at things like, what is its battery performance? and whether or not it's hogging memory, things like that, and looking at network interactions, just to make sure that whatever you have included is going to be useful in the long run. Now you have to balance that with rewriting it yourself, which a lot of times you can do that a lot worse, especially if there's not testing or wide usage like there would be for some of the open source libraries that are out there. So you really want to make sure you mitigate that risk and only cut the ones and rewrite the ones that make the most sense. And if you can get by without the functionality, then just do it yourself. Cool, so data, we have a lot of it, they don't. We're privileged because we basically have ubiquitous access to really good internet and, like I mentioned, Wi-Fi. Sadly I am rate limited right now. Again, I think it's because of Snapchat, but in Berlin I had a similar experience because I just did like keynote there, and I ended up not being able to do basically anything. Most of the time I get whatever. I'm very frustrated whenever I don't get good access, and this is, globally, it's spotty at best for the most part. So I know you've experienced slow internet, but think about that as your day-to-day normal experience. And one interesting thing here is Google found that up to 10% of somebody's income was spent on data in developing markets. So 10% of the income is half my rent for me and 23 times what I pay for my own data. So they're paying a significant portion of their income towards data. So it really matters to them. Again, slight inconvenience to us. Yep, going back to the idea of offline first, make sure that the experience is actually meaningful. Give them some sort of cached information. You can do things like using job managers and using Firebase that syncs with the cloud. You could also do things like lazy fetching and figure out what data changes a lot, what data doesn't change a lot. Like I call them slow lanes and fast lanes. So what are my data slow lanes? What are my fast lanes? Create jobs to go fetch all that information. Because, for example, service levels for us, which is the box and the accessories, don't change that often, but other things do change, hourly, maybe even by the minute. You can also do things like reducing the file sizes of images by using WebP or a similar format instead of doing JPEG. And whenever you can, bundle things in the APK, but again, you're balancing that with the keep it around 10 megabyte recommendation. So it just depends what makes sense for your particular use case. I don't know about you, but my battery barely lasts a day. Usually doesn't. I have packs with me, a little electrified purse, for example. It's just very frustrating. But if you're in a rural village, you might have to walk pretty far to get that charged, and you're going to have to pay somebody. There's even businesses where people are picking up phones, biking them to the nearest electrified village, and returning them later so that people don't have to walk and spend all that time getting their battery charged. Now, from the tech perspective, we can do things like checking the docking state. If they're plugged in, then maybe we want to fetch more data, especially if they're on Wi-Fi. But you don't want to do that while they're sleeping. So you just kind of have to think about, what is the most efficient usage of their data and their battery. Basically, all three of these interlock. And it's kind of hard to separate them into this, but all of them really add up to battery usage as well. Cool. And then one of our last sections here, we're going to talk a little bit about testing and how you can validate that your app actually works throughout the world. Now, one thing to keep in mind, testing isn't just for QA. This is something that I've run into. A lot of people just like, I write my code and then I just throw it over the wall. But really, we should all be thinking about testing at every stage of the process. For developers, we should be writing tests when we write the code. Designers should be validating not only the design with users, but also the implementation of their designs. QA should obviously be doing QA sorts of things. Automate all the things we can. That really makes your life easier. Basically, everyone should be thinking about it at all times, which goes into the always be testing. The only bit I missed there is that you also should be dog fooding your application within your organization. So you might want to set up things like automated builds where people can go and fetch the latest one, or automated beta deployments that go to people's phones, that sort of thing, making sure that someone has your application and is regularly seeing it and playing with it. I already covered all of that. So basically you should test, and you can do things like Espresso as well. Cool, so you also want to set up a device lab, and this can be a virtual device lab or a physical device lab or some combination of both. But basically, you want to make sure that you are simulating some of the experiences that people are going to do. Now, the easy stuff is just turning off the emulator's Wi-Fi and then turning back on. But how do you also need to do like slow internet speeds and all that sort of stuff. Some companies are doing things like Wednesday's the slow internet day, and everybody uses the app on that to try and find what are the most annoying parts of the application. So that can be an interesting path for your organization. But yeah, basically you're checking that they're not using too much data, that it works offline or in poor network situations. And then you could do things like go off hiking and see how it works as well. That's another good use case. So that's more real world instead of trying to simulate it. As far as battery goes, you can use Battery Historian to try and figure out what is sucking up the most battery. And then you also want to think about doze, which came through in Marshmallow, which basically puts your device in a very deep sleep. So if you're not handling that properly, you might have a lot of random crashes and stuff. So you should really be thinking about what that does as well. Basically, if you're not familiar with it, it shuts down network access, scheduled jobs, and other things that might be waking up the battery over and over again. Promises 20% battery increase. I don't know. We'll see. And finally, in the testing piece, make sure that you're actually reporting out findings to people and notifying them when the build breaks, things like that, so that people can be invested in it. Cool. Now that we've explored the biggest challenges in design, technology, and testing, let's talk a little bit about how you can be a more globally inclusive coder. So Android is really built on the idea of openness, that you can use, change, and adapt the design, and that should really apply to us as developers as well. We should really be trying to make our app accessible for all the users out there. And we're going to talk about 4 different components with this, which is citizenship, humility, empathy, and efficiency, which is the only really technical one here. So for citizenship, first, you're part of the world and all of its beauty. You really can affect it for the better, and I hope that you're excited about bringing your talents. You can bring them to the global stage and help serve all your users, not just the privileged few who can afford iPhones, for example. Think globally when you're creating your apps, but really work within your local variable scope. Make sure that you're standing up for your users and making the changes that are most important to them. Another aspect of this is you are not better than your users. That's called, so basically you shouldn't think that you're better than your users that have fewer privileges, because you're not better. You're another person, they're another person, they have very different life experiences. That doesn't mean that you're a better person. Make sure that you're not looking down on your users, and don't assume that the solutions that you make are the right ones and that person's an idiot because they don't understand what I'm trying to do, that sort of things. You're really going to have a hard time connecting with people in the world if that's your view. You should really try and question your assumptions and step outside your comfort zone and connect with people that you normally wouldn't connect with. Which kind of leads into empathy a bit. This is one of the things where you have to realize your experiences don't mirror the rest of the world. You need to start connecting and understanding other people. It is a learned trait, though. You can practice it. Some of the ways that Chad Fowler, who has a blog on this, suggests is basically take an active interest in the world. For example, meet new people at the conference, put your phone down or in your bag, and actually talk. Also, when you're listening, I'm bad at this, don't just listen to jump in at the next point. Just listen to actually hear them and then correspond instead of just saying, oh, this is the thing I want to say over and over again. Again, that's something I need to work on. And then finally, you can kind of observe as a third-party person to help figure out what is going on for each person and kind of getting a better insight into what they might be thinking and feeling. So I'm a big proponent of travel. I don't know how much you like traveling, but I would highly suggest it. If you haven't done it, please get out of the United States. I'm sure you can afford it. Go. But basically, it's really hard to put into words how transformative that experience is. You'll just really have to see it for yourself. And then finally, we're going to talk about efficiency a little bit. It should really be your primary operating principle instead of something that you're thinking about bolting on later. If you write a crappy app now and then just hope you can scale it, you're probably going to run into some issues. So it should really permeate pretty much every aspect of your application. And here I have some themes that I didn't go into deep here, but basically this isn't everything we could be tackling. So reducing your images and tuning your performance across the app. This is important whoever you're serving. Now I can hear you thinking, well, I'll never be able to get my boss, product owner, whoever on board with these changes that you want to make. But What if you didn't really need their permission? What if you just did it? What if you showed leadership and then told them later, oh, you know what I did? I made our app start half as quickly. I mean, twice as quickly. And then they're like, oh my gosh, that's pretty awesome. And then you can, if you have analytics, and you can say, oh, and look at what percentage of whatever happened. Just, that's the sort of thing I do in my career. So I would highly encourage you to do it if you haven't tried to just do something and then sell it later. It's pretty empowering. Sometimes it doesn't work out, but it's pretty awesome whenever it does work out. Basically, have the courage to stand up for your users because you know that if you care about them, you can really express that and get people on board afterwards, especially if you've already done the work. They're not going to throw it away if it's done, probably. But basically, we've covered 4 principles here to live by when you're serving both emerging and developed markets. First, be a better global citizen and bring your talents to the world. Second, have humility and realize that you're not better than your users. Have empathy for what your users experience. And finally, write an application that's fast and efficient. When you truly value the user experience, you can connect with billions of people, and you're exposing them to new opportunities and a world of possibilities. There are challenges, but we should be tackling them, and they're not that hard to tackle. Your reach is greater than you ever imagined, and it's just going to continue to grow and grow as the years go on as we impact more and more billions in the world. You're making a positive impact, one person and one app at a time. Thank you.